Dr. K, I'd like you to review the anxious generation and talk about its implication for post-traumatic parents. Hi, I'm Dr. Robin Koslowitz, YouTube's post-traumatic parenting expert. Today I'm responding to a comment on one of my other videos where a community member asked if I could review the anxious generation, but specifically from the lens of post-traumatic parenting and also from a sense of how seriously should we take this book. I agree with many of the arguments and the premises that Jonathan Haidt puts into the anxious generation, with some cautions and some caveats. But first, if you're a post-traumatic parent and this is a topic that interests you, if you're curious about books like The Anxious Generation and how much they should or should not inform your parenting, click subscribe below so you never miss another episode. So The Anxious Generation is a book by social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who is a professor in NYU Stern School of Business, my alma mater. Although I didn't go to the School of Business, I went to the School of Applied Psychology, and Dr. Haidt was never a professor of mine. And he wrote a book about children and the why we are raising children who seem to be more anxious, why there is a mental health crisis facing the youth, and why today's youth seem different than previous generations. And his basic thesis, which I think people are misunderstanding, is that social media has replaced, or largely replaced, a lot of social interaction. I was going to say social interaction for children. And he believes that this is like the biggest social science experiment that's being perpetuated on children without any institutional review board, without any consent, without anybody saying, wait a minute, before we do this experiment, perhaps we should figure out if we should be doing this at all, and if we should, how we should keep it safe. People just sort of jumped into allowing their kids to have social media, and it's been having an impact. Now, I think, number one, there is a big criticism of his arguments from people who say that, the internet is not so bad, social media can be beneficial, there are a lot of kids who feel marginalized, who find support on social media. Children with certain psychological diagnoses find out about their diagnoses because they educate themselves on social media. There's so many tech, advantages, like over COVID, to like having the ability to have online or hybrid school, online learning tools like Khan Academy, being able to go onto YouTube and have somebody who isn't your mom, who no longer remembers 9th grade algebra, explain how to solve a quadratic equation or something when you're, when you're trying to get your homework done. This is huge. And I think people who make that complaint about Jonathan Haidt are really missing that he's not saying that it's the internet and social media that is driving this youth mental health crisis. It's the lack of real world, that primary social interactions. The idea that if most of your socializing is online and, socializing with peers is sort of like the cherry on the top, or, the condiment as opposed to the main dish, that's a problem. That's really what his argument is. He's not saying this social media platform's good, this one's bad, this kind of video game's good, this kind's bad. It's not really his argument, although he does talk about, the link between video games and violence and things like that, or radicalization online, but he's not really saying that. He's saying his general metaphor in the book is this idea that imagine if someone says to you, we're going to be doing this experiment, we're sending your kids to Mars, they're going to be growing up on Mars, and we have no idea how living on Mars is going to affect their socialization, we have no idea how it's going to affect their height, their weight, their nutritional needs, what not living under, a yellow sun is going to do to their growth patterns. Like, we have no idea, but we're doing it anyway. So what he's really saying is not, I know 100% for sure that Instagram is specifically responsible for anxiety disorders and TikTok is specifically responsible for the rise in suicidality. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is, we used to have this thing called social interaction, and it was good, and it helped children become what he references the book Anti-Fragile. It helped kids become anti-fragile, because if you have an argument in the real world, you have real world feedback, right? Like you say something mean to your friend, and your friend gets that look on their face, and your mirror neurons seeing that look, you get a feeling in the pit of your stomach, and you learn that maybe just joking is not such a good thing to do. Or you and your friend get into a fist fight over something one of you says, and eventually you learn that, like, we could probably resolve this without the use of our fists. Whereas when you go and move to online, you might not have that real world feedback. You say something mean to your friend and you get canceled. You say something mean to your friends take screenshots of it to use as ammunition the next time you're in an argument about something else. There's all sorts of unforeseen implications. And his idea is, we don't know what that does to kids. We know what playground fights does to kids. We know what, having that like just joking relational aggression does to kids, and we know how to help them with it. We don't know as much about what social media type altercations do to kids, so we should proceed with a lot of caution. I don't think that's a bad argument. I also don't think that that's the argument. When people like complain about his book, I think they're complaining about the wrong argument. The argument he is making is that replacing real world interaction with anything else is not good. Not that any particular social media platform or type of interaction is good or bad. The next thing that people very often, say about his work, and they're going to say this in general about a lot of people like him. I look at Jonathan Haidt as a celebrity intellectual, celebrity professor, sort of like Adam Grant or maybe Angela Duckworth, right? People who have real credentials, like he's an actual professor with the actual PhD and all that goes with it, which means he's been trained in academic rigor, but he's a celebrity. And crucially, just because he has academic credentials does not mean that he is using them and writing an academic paper, a research-based academic paper, when he's writing a book for popular consumption. It's very hard to do that, right? To balance that need. On the one hand, you're writing something interesting for people to read and have a dinner table discussion about. You're not actually conducting a rigorous study. Because when you're conducting a rigorous study, as somebody who has been in that PhD world, nobody's buying it, right? It's not fun to read. In fact, when I started communicating on social media, I remember my first social media manager saying to me, you need to learn how to break your geek speak habit. And it's true, geek speak is, why use one simple to understand word when many multisyllabic words will suffice? And it takes time to learn how not to over-explain, and I still haven't totally broken that habit, and to learn what people are going to find interesting and informative and what's just really boring or statistically interesting for 5 other academics but nobody else cares. That takes time. He's a good writer. He is a good celebrity intellectual, but this book is not a work of research. It is based upon research. So when people say he's cherry picking the data, well, yeah. That's what you do when you argue a case. You choose the data that supports your thesis and you use that data because you're making a case for something. And so the cherry picking the data, now cherry picking the data in the sense of being deceptive might mean, if there's 27 studies that conclusively demonstrate one outcome and there are 2 that, demonstrate the opposite outcome, talking about the 2 without at all talking about the 27, that would be malicious cherry picking, right? Because then what you're doing is you're deliberately confusing people, right? That's the famous line of there are lies, damn lies in statistics, right? There's a lot of ways to play around with statistics, but he's not doing that. He's not picking the one study that says the thing he wants it to say, well, there's a million other studies that say something else. But he is aggregating data that support his claim, and he does talk about the disagreements. He talks a lot about the other side of the argument. For example, when he talks about the mental health crisis, he talks about the fact that the stigma around mental health is lowering, so perhaps some of the rise in mental health diagnoses amongst teens, right, in anxiety disorders, depression, suicidality, whatever the statistic you're worrying about is, that some of that might be that people are more comfortable reporting, and that's actually a positive benefit of social media, because if a kid is not afraid to go to therapy, that would be great, because they can get the help that they need with the disorder that they have. So he does actually address the other aspect of the data, the data that might disagree. A lot of people also talk about this idea that correlation is not causation. Correlation is not causation. We know that. We know that, and we know that, and we know that. But correlation is also not causation, meaning that there are many things that are correlated that actually there is a causal factor. It just means that correlation is not enough to prove causation. But correlation can be very suggestive, and correlation is something we should pay a lot of attention to. If, I don't know, a town starts gets a new water source, and everybody's using the new water source, and suddenly there's a huge amount of incidences of cancer in that town. So if you went to the mayor and said, oh gosh, ever since we put in this new water source, there's been like a quadrupling of cases of cancer in this town, I think we should, sample the water and make sure there's nothing poisonous or toxic in there. And the mayor of your town says, correlation is not causation, elect a new mayor, right? Because, correlation is not causation, but correlation is very often the first place we look. Like now, the first thing so here's us being intuitive statisticians. Every mom in that town wants that water tested, right? Absolutely. Now, it may be true. Correlation may not be causation, and it may be that a new factory opened up at the outskirts of town, and the water source and the factory happened at the same time, and it was actually the new factory that was poisoning the soil and causing cancer, right? That's why correlation is not causation, but correlation needs to be investigated. So saying correlation is not causation does not say, okay, therefore rip up Jonathan Haidt's book and throw it in the garbage, right? It's a starting point. Now, here are some, issues I have with the book, and it's not necessarily the book. I think it's with how people are using the book. I think there's a lot of, first thing we have to know is Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist. Social psychologists investigate societies and trends within societies and how societies change. Social psychologists are not clinical psychologists. They don't deal with mental health. They don't treat patients. They don't work on studies of like understanding how disorders come to be and how to help people who are dealing with them, right? That's not what they do at all. I'm a psychologist. Jonathan Haidt's a psychologist. Our days look very different. Jonathan Haidt spends his day with a lot of numbers and a lot of students because he's a professor, and a lot of words. I spend my day with a lot of people and a lot of children and a lot of parents, because that's what a clinical psychologist does. So that's just a little bit different. So sometimes when people are taking his conclusions very seriously and his recommendations very seriously, they're confusing those two fields. He is not a clinician. So I feel like he sometimes makes certain errors, or he's taken too seriously by people who don't necessarily draw that distinction. For example, in the book, he says that we should raise the age that children have smartphones from 13 to 16. Why 16? No reason particular. He just decided that sounds like a good number. It's not really how clinicians who are using data from the population and using understanding of children's neurology, our understanding of mental health, our understanding of psychological disorders. That's not really how we make decisions like that. But there are definitely schools and education conferences and principals and movements who are just taking his number as though it's been demonstrated, experimentally demonstrated, 15's bad, 16's good. Personally, I am a mom who does not believe that kids should have social media until they reach the age of consent, because I think you need to be an adult to understand the risks and benefits of posting on social media. I think that social media algorithms can absolutely mess with your sense of self and can absolutely mess with your confidence. So personally, I don't believe in anybody having a smartphone until they're 18. That's my own personal belief. And why smartphone and not social media? I'm saying that because I really think that if you have a smartphone, you end up with social media. And again, I'm just saying that I think that, not that I know that. But in my experience working with teenagers, it's Day one, I get a smartphone for whatever reason, because it makes more sense, and I want to email, and I want to play certain games, and whatever. Day two, I have Snapchat. Like, that seems to be, again, it's just my practice, kids I've worked with, that is not at all indicative of the larger population or anything like that. But it's like, if you're very tempted to have TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram and social media in general, and then you actually own a smartphone, that temptation, like, we know what's going to happen next. So, and that's me being a mom even more than a clinical psychologist. But statistically speaking, and when I say statistically speaking, I simply mean that when humans are faced with temptation with very few barriers to their temptation, they're probably going to give into that temptation, or they're going to waste a lot of willpower trying not to give into that temptation. But either way, yeah, it's a losing battle at that point. Another thing in his book that I found questionable as a mental health professional, like that kind of psychologist, is he seems to be disapproving of trigger warnings, or at least he's using trigger warnings as a way to prove or demonstrate that children's mental health is on the decline and kids are less resilient. He uses the term anti-fragile, and he quotes that book, and he's talking about how trigger warnings, he seems to think, and the concept of safe spaces make kids more fragile and less anti-fragile. I think he's completely misunderstanding how trigger warnings are meant to work. The idea behind a trigger warning is actually to make you more anti-fragile, because the concept of anti-fragility simply means there are certain substances that become stronger when you expose them to stress, like a muscle, right? If you work a muscle, then what happens is you stress the muscle, you actually cause micro rips to appear on that muscle. And then your body secretes more muscle fiber to patch that little rip, and then the muscle gets stronger. So when you're talking about humans are supposed to be anti-fragile in the way that a muscle is. Exposing humans to stress makes them to tolerable, expected levels of stress can make them more resilient, anti-fragile, etc. Here's the problem with what he's saying. You're supposed to be exposing biological entities to tolerable amounts of stress. It has to be, in other words, if you overload a muscle to the point where you like dislocate your shoulder, you rip your tendon, you tear your ACL, whatever, you tear the meniscus in your knee, then that is not an anti-fragile injury, that's an injury. You're doing more exercise is not going to repair your torn ACL. You can do rehab around the muscles, but you're going to have to fix that. If you tear your meniscus, it's not going to knit itself back together. A trigger warning is meant to say to a child who is dealing with a very high level of stress, we're going to warn you before something is going to become intolerable, so you don't rip your, metaphorical ACL in your brain. So if you have a child who was just in a house fire and the fire was overwhelming and they develop PTSD, they probably should not be watching a video in class where there's going to be a fire without having some warning, like we're about to expose you to a view of fire. Think of the concept of an isometric exercise. An isometric exercise is an exercise where you're doing a static hold. Like, for example, you might do a plank. That would be an isometric exercise. So when you do a plank, you're going to tighten your core, and you might hear pull your belly button into your tailbone, right? You brace yourself, and the better your form, the longer you can hold, and then your ab muscles get stronger, your core gets stronger, and then you can progressively hold your plank for longer and longer. A trigger warning tells a psyche, brace, right? Gird yourself, be ready, because something is going to be stressful. And if someone's like, no, my house fire was like yesterday, my dog died, I do not want to see an image of a house fire right now, they can leave the room, right? Because we don't want them to actually be injured. We want tolerable levels of stress. Now, if you have a kid who's like, I'm not going to school because someone might say the word fire, we might, in therapy, in exposure therapy, what we might do is, let's gradually allow you to experience slightly more stressful situations until the idea of fire isn't scary for you anymore, and now you can go back to school, right? So trigger warnings, the way he's describing them, he's saying that they contribute to fragility, is not true. trigger warnings contribute to anti-fragility. So again, that's the difference between being a social psychologist and a clinical psychologist, because I think he's misunderstanding something fundamental here. So that to me was one of the weaker parts of his book. I think one very strong aspect of his book is where he talks about, Lenore Skenazy and her whole idea of free-range parenting, the idea that like kids don't have third spaces. Like they have home, they have school. They don't have places to congregate and hang out that aren't online. The idea that kids need risky play. And by risky play, I mean like you need to bump and bruise yourself on the playground sometimes. You need to run around. You need to like try to do the monkey bars and fail and try and fail and try and fail until you can do them. You need to fall off your bike, right? And his idea that kids need those experiences and they're not having them, that we're over policing kids, because it's true. If you see like a group of kids, young kids hanging out and there's no supervision, someone's going to call the cops nowadays, which wasn't the case in the 70s and 80s. A friend of mine was once joking with me that the reason for the popularity of Stranger Things is nostalgia for the kind of, childhood where like a posse of kids get on a bike and like explore a creepy house, at the outskirts of town. Like we don't do that anymore. If you think about Stand By Me, like, right, like that having kids be able to explore with each other and figure out relationships and their lives and adversity, and yeah, occasionally you fall off your bike or you hurt yourself, but that's okay. And then you learn how to cope with adversity and you learn problem-solving skills. That's important. This to me is the strongest argument in his book, that kids need to socialize in the real world. Kids need to stretch their big muscles and play outdoors, and we are doing way too much supervision of kids, outdoors, and not nearly enough supervision of kids indoors when they're on devices. I think he is 100% correct about that. In terms of like kids' screen time, and we're taking screen time apart from social media, I really think it's important. If your kid is into a show, a singer, a song, a book, a movie, anything, please watch it and know what your kids' metaphors are, know what they're into. If they're into a certain TikTok, if they're into a certain YouTuber, watch the channel with them every so often, get a sense of what's going on, because it's important, I think, to know their world. Just like you probably would call someone before your kid goes over to a sleepover, even in the 80s, you probably would call the parents and just make sure that they have adequate supervision in their home and, that you're comfortable sending your kid there. So in the same way, if your kids are doing things online, like I'm not saying even social media, I'm talking now about, passively watching a YouTube channel, a movie, a book, a song, a TV show, anything, make sure you know what that's about, because I think it's important to have conversations with our kids about whatever they're living, whatever aspects of their life they're living, and some of that life is lived online, so you need to know about the parts of their life that are lived online. So let's analyze this book with implications for post-traumatic parents. I think post-traumatic parents often default very quickly to either many, many yeses or many, many no's. And there's a video on this YouTube channel where I talk about the automatic no response as post-traumatic parents. So I think there are certain post-traumatic parents who are going to read this book and default to like automatic no, we are getting rid of the internet in our house, and come to think of it, calculators are bad for kids' math ability too, and also we're going to unplug everything because we need to go back to Little House on the Prairie. There's going to be people who are going to knee-jerk to that. And then there's going to be people who are going to knee-jerk the other way. There's plenty of people who disagree with Jonathan Haidt, so I'm going to give my kids screen time because I don't know how to say no to my kids. It's hard to say no to my kids as a post-traumatic parent. I'm a people pleaser, and saying no feels really stressful for me because my children are people, and when people pleasers don't please people, people aren't pleased. So if I say no, they won't be pleased, and that's a scary thought. So I think for post-traumatic parents, it's important to use this book to aid in your discernment. If you had a gut level feeling that too much screen time is a problem and that your kids are not doing well with as much screen time, it's time to make some changes. And maybe that means having a family meeting and discussing your values with a parenting partner, with a, with somebody who's helping you with your parenting, with a mental health professional, with a spiritual advisor, whoever's helping you think out your parenting. And come up with some rules and have a conversation with your kids. Remember that rules are not necessarily about no's. Rules are very often about yeses. Screen time is okay after homework. Social media is okay when you're older than this and this age, but only these platforms and not these platforms. YouTube is okay to watch, but not to interact on, right? Like, you have the right to create an algorithm and sit down with your kids and flexibly talk about the various aspects of social media that you're comfortable with and not comfortable with. For a lot of post-traumatic parents, the one thing that I would suggest as a hard and fast rule is many of us with PTSD don't sleep well, and then we pass on our sleep issues to our kids. The one hard and fast rule that I believe everyone should have is no screens in bedrooms, no matter what. I've had patients who tell me that, they keep their phone under their pillow because if there's a notification on social media, they want to see it immediately. That feels like voluntarily having a newborn baby for 4 years of high school. That doesn't sound like fun at all. It definitely interferes with deep, restful sleep. So that's one rule that I feel like you can feel good about. Screens don't belong in bedrooms. Problematic social media interactions are likely to happen in middle of the night with questionable adults when the questionable adults know that parents are not likely to be looking over their kid's shoulder. So 2 a.m. in a chat, in some sort of a role-playing game online is a very high time for predators to strike. So no screens in bedrooms. If you're using social media, you have to use it in public. Those kinds of rules make a lot of sense. And even for post-traumatic parents who do tend to people please and don't like to say no to their kids, these are rules you can feel good about. And then you can feel good about, perhaps I'm not people pleasing 16-year-old you, but 25-year-old you, future you, is going to be really happy that I did this. So that idea that, okay, I'm people-pleasing 25-year-old you, and perhaps that will give you permission to set some of those no's. As far as I'm concerned, overall, I give the book a pretty big thumbs up. I agree with a lot of what he's saying. I agree that social media is having unforeseen implications on kids' mental health, and I really think we should take his arguments seriously. We shouldn't overvalue them as clinical arguments. We shouldn't take 16 as his hard and fast rule until we've got some evidence for that. But I think we should take his cautions very seriously and pay attention to what he's saying, because he is advancing a well-reasoned, well-thought-out argument. Doesn't mean it's perfect, doesn't mean it's academic, but it is well-reasoned and well-thought out. If you agree, if you disagree, if you have a different thought, if you picked up something else in his book that you want to talk about, please comment below and let me know. If you have a friend, a fellow post-traumatic parent who needs this channel, who talks about these concepts, who wants to hear more about this, please tag them or send them this video, because the post-traumatic parenting community grows one post-traumatic parent at a time. If you want to hang out where your fellow post-traumatic parents hang out, check out the Post-Traumatic Parenting podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to read my blog about parenting on Psychology Today, you can find it at Targeted Parenting. My website is drrobinkoslowitz.com, and you can find pre-launch information about the Post-Traumatic Parenting book, which is coming out in 2025. Till next time.